Ukraine's air defense is under serious strain after another wave of Russian drone attacks, leaving more than 1 million consumers in Kyiv without electricity and thousands of apartment buildings without heating. President Zelenskyy said the strikes have once again targeted critical infrastructure, deepening the pressure on the country's energy system and daily life in the capital. At the same time, Ukrainian officials are working with the United States and European partners on possible meetings and new support packages. Kyiv says air defense missiles, weapons and equipment for recovery and reserves are needed on a daily basis, and that international formats only matter if they deliver real results for Ukraine. Zelenskyy also pointed to internal problems in how Ukraine's Air Force operations are organized in the fight against Shahed drones, saying the issue is not only about resources, but about how the system itself is run.
The performance of the Air Force against the Shaheds is unsatisfactory. We have interceptors, significant forces are engaged, mobile fire groups, F-16S are available, but the organization of Air Force operations must be different. We reviewed this situation separately with the Minister of Defense. Conclusions will be drawn.
The British Army is preparing for a potential conflict as early as 2027, according to the UK's Chief of the General Staff, General Ronald Walker, speaking to the UK Defence Journal. Walker said the military cannot wait for an ideal army of 2035 and instead plans to rapidly transform the force it has now. His goal is to double Britain's combat power by 2027 and triple it by 2030. Artificial intelligence, he said, will be at the center of that shift. The army is moving toward a 2040-40 model, where a smaller share of a firepower comes from heavy, crewed platforms, such as tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and attack helicopters, and a larger share from drones and low-cost, mass-produced strike systems. Walker argued these systems can be built faster and deployed at scale. Since the autumn of 2025, he said, the UK has invested more than £200 million in domestic weapons programs, partially aimed at supporting Ukraine. Among the milestones, Britain expects the Challenger 3 tanks to reach initial operational readiness by 2027, problems with the Ajax armored vehicles to be resolved, and the deployment of 600 Boxer armored carriers. By 2029, the first RCH-155 self-propelled artillery systems are expected to enter service. Walker also announced plans to replace more than 13,000 outdated vehicles across the British Army's ground forces. Kirill Dmitriev arrived in Davos not just to talk about peace, but to shape the political space around it, to keep attention focused on process rather than outcomes. That strategy was on display when US President Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff met with the Kremlin-linked negotiator on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum. Both sides quickly described the talks as very positive and constructive. According to pro-Kremlin media, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner was also involved in the contacts. Dmitriev went further, claiming that more people are now starting to understand Russia's position. The meeting fits into a broader US-led peace initiative. Witkoff and Kushner had earlier held consultations with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the leaders of the United Kingdom, France and Germany. In Washington, officials signal that most elements of a framework have been aligned with Kyiv and that they are now waiting for Moscow's response. The Kremlin says it is open to serious negotiations, but only on its own terms, insisting that any talks focus on what it calls the root causes of the war. Ukrainian analyst Maxim Nesvitailov cautions against seeing this as a breakthrough. He argues that Moscow is less focused on ending the war than on managing the narrative around it, shifting the conversation toward sanctions, economic incentives, and potential concessions. In his view, Dmitriev plays a central role in keeping that narrative alive, presenting Russia as a rational, pragmatic partner, sustaining the appearance of momentum, even as measurable progress towards ending the war remains absent. A major post-war recovery deal for Ukraine, an economic development plan valued at $800 billion involving the United States, Europe and Kyiv was expected to be announced in Davos. Instead, it has been put on hold. The Financial Times, citing 6 officials, reports that the talks slowed after tensions rose between Washington and several European capitals, changing the tone of the forum and complicating negotiations with President Donald Trump's team. One thing is clear, nothing has been signed, one official told the paper. Another said European governments were not prepared to move forward with high-profile agreements, while broader political disputes with the White House remained unresolved. According to Financial Times sources, the shift in mood also affected security-level discussions this week, with at least one planned meeting going ahead with the U.S. representative. Officials stress, however, that the so-called prosperity plan for Ukraine has not been abandoned and could still be signed at a later stage once the political climate allows talks to regain momentum. A meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has also been expected in Davos. Zelenskyy later said he would remain in Kyiv to oversee efforts to restore power and heating after Russian strikes, adding that he would travel only if the recovery agreement or concrete decisions on air defense and energy support were ready. U.S. forces have taken control of another oil tanker linked to Venezuela, marking the 7th such vessel intercepted under Donald Trump's push to regulate how Venezuelan crude reached global market. The U.S. Southern Command said the ship, the motor vessel Sagitta, was boarded on the Caribbean without incident. According to the military, the tanker was operating in defiance of restrictions imposed by Trump on vessels under U.S. sanctions. Sagitta sails under a Liberian flag and is registered to a Hong Kong-based company. The ship last transmitted its position more than 2 months ago after leaving the Baltic Sea in northern Europe. U.S. authorities say the vessel itself is sanctioned under an executive order tied to Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. President Trump said the United States has already removed tens of millions of barrels of oil from Venezuela and is selling it on the open market. He added that his administration is pursuing large-scale investment plans aimed at restoring and upgrading Venezuela's oil production and distribution system. Russia is no longer fighting only in Ukraine. It is waging a broader shadow war against the West. That is the warning from Foreign Affairs, which argues that the Kremlin now treats Europe, NATO, and Russian opposition abroad as a part of the same battlefield. The magazine says Moscow views Western support for Ukraine, sanctions, and even the protection of Russian dissidents as a direct challenge to the survival of Putin's regime. As a result, what were once described as a hybrid operations are increasingly becoming physical, targeting people and infrastructure, even inside NATO territory. Foreign Affairs calls this a shadow war, a coordinated campaign of pressure and attacks designed to weaken an opponent without crossing the line that would trigger an open military response. But the risk, the authors warn, is growing with every new incident. A drone could bring down a civilian airliner. A cyber attack could cripple a healthcare system or national power grid. And the casualties, they say, may one day appear not in Ukraine, but inside a NATO country. The magazine argues that Europe and its allies need to move beyond what is described as an endless expression of concern and toward action. Clear consultation mechanism inside NATO, faster intelligence sharing, active cyber and intelligence operations against Russian networks, rapid economic and political sanctions, and in extreme cases, limited but open military steps when lives or critical systems are under threat. At the same time, Foreign Affairs points to a paradox. Europe's caution, meant to avoid escalation, also fits the Kremlin's narrative of being under siege, a story that, in the magazine's view, helps drive Russia toward even riskier moves. The United States is planning to cut around 200 positions across several key NATO command centers, according to Reuters, citing 3 sources familiar with the matter. The roles are tied to the oversight and planning of the alliance military and intelligence operation, a move that is already fueling concern in Europe about Washington's long-term commitment to NATO. Sources say the Trump administration has informed some European capitals about the plan. The destruction could affect the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center in the United Kingdom, the Allied Special Operations Command in Brussels, and NATO's Naval Command Strict for NATO in Portugal, among other units. While the sources did not specify the exact reasons, They linked the move to the administration's broader goal of shifting more resources toward the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, they stressed that the cuts would be limited when compared with the overall US military footprint in Europe. Around 8,000 US troops are currently stationed across the continent, nearly half of them in Germany. President Donald Trump has previously questioned whether NATO would come to the United States defense, given the scale of American funding for the alliance. In European capitals, such remarks, along with other foreign policy initiatives, have intensified debate about trust, burden sharing, and the future of the transatlantic security framework. That's all for now. For more content, please subscribe.